Okay, like we said, we're going through some cleanup procedures. So I want us to tackle this. When the user visits the series page, if he's not logged in, he can be asked to log in, and if he doesn't have an account, he can be asked to sign up. Then, if the user is already logged in, remember we talked about redirecting him to the latest series he watched so that he can just continue. But if he hasn't yet started the series, then he can start from the beginning. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is writing a little test. So we'll head over to our user test, and this test is simply going to help us to get the next lesson that the user is supposed to be watching. Okay, so for example, if in a particular series the user has finished user 1, series 1 for example, and we have an array of 1, 2, 3, and actually that series has 4 lessons or 5 as such. When the user clicks on the continue learning button, we want to redirect the user to lesson 4 and not lesson 1 because he's already watched lesson 1. Okay, so we'll create a method that will actually get the latest, which is this one, and then it's going to get the next lesson in the database, which is this one, and then redirect the user to that one. Okay, so let's just create that test. Test can get next series or lesson to be watched by user. Okay, so what do we need? Let's just say we need all of this set up, and we need just one series, I think, in this case. So we have to flush redis, then we have user, and then we have a new lesson, we have another lesson in that same series, and why don't we create a third lesson in the same series? Okay, then what we're going to do is we'll complete lesson 1 and 2, and then we'll assert that when we try to visit the watch series route, we are redirected to lesson 3. Okay, so we'll say user complete lesson, or complete lesson 1, or also complete lesson 2. Okay, so actually this is a unit test, so let's just test that the method works, and then we'll write a feature test to test the redirect. Okay, so right now what we want to do is say next lesson equals user get next lesson to watch for a series. So we'll pass in the series right here. Okay, so get next lesson to watch is the method that we want to create, and this method will take in the series, search our Redis database, get the values or the lessons that have been completed, and then it's going to get the next lesson that the user is supposed to be watching. Okay, so we'll just assert equals, and what we can do is compare the ID. So we want, this is lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, so we want lesson 3 ID to be equal to next lesson ID. And this is something we have to think about, because remember we haven't yet told our lessons what order they should play in. So let's go ahead and make sure we do that. We want to rewrite the factory settings. So in our lesson factory, if we just check it out, what we are doing is we are simply assigning the episode number to 100, but in this case we want to make sure that we order these episodes in the correct order. So lesson 1 should be 100, lesson 2 would be 200, and lesson 3 would be 300. Okay, so they're gonna play in that order such that when we complete lesson 1 and 2, the next should be lesson 3. Okay, so assert equals this. I think this is one assertion we need to run. How about creating a 4th lesson, and we would have exactly this, but this would be for the 4th. And then what we can do to solidify our assertions is we'll complete lesson 3 right here after we've run our first assertion, and then would call our assertion again. Okay, so remember, the more assertions you have, the more difficult it is for your test or your assertions to be deceptive. Okay, so we have our next lesson. When we assert that it equals this, what we'll do is we'll call this method again, and we'll say assert equals lesson 4, and we'll get the ID right here. Okay, so after asserting that lesson 3 is the next one to play, we'll complete lesson 3, and then we'll assert that lesson 4 is the next one to play. So I think that test is set. Let's go ahead and run it. PHP unit filter with that test. Okay, so we need to create the next lesson to watch method. I'll head over to my learning.php and I'll create that, and this takes in the series. I'll run that again and trying to get property of known object as expected. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to get all the lessons completed for that series, and then we want to just return the last one. That's what we want to do, right? So we should have a method right here that returns to us all the lessons completed. So get number of completed lessons, get completed lessons for a series. Okay, so what we can do is we can say lesson ID equals end, and this is simply a PHP method that will give us the last element of an array, and we'll call this get completed lessons for a series, and we'll pass in series. Okay, so let's actually check out that method to make sure we're doing the correct thing. We said get array of completed lesson IDs for a series, and this is the helpful way that we can actually use our doc blocks, because right now I'm trying to verify if this method actually returns what I want it to return, and we can check out the doc blocks. It returns an array and the parameter is a series of type broadcast series, and this is what it does. Great, so we can use it. Okay, so once we get that ID, all we want to do is return lesson find, and we'll pass lesson ID. So we can actually inline this by not having to create this variable. So we can cut this out and paste it right here. Okay, so get next lesson to watch. It's going to get the last element in the get completed lessons for a series array, and then it's going to use that to find the lesson. Okay, so let's run that test one more time, and it says only variable should be passed by reference. Okay, this is something that PHP does. We can't call methods in methods in methods too many times nested as such, so let's just stick with the variable. So lesson ID is going to be equal to this, and we'll pass in lesson ID. Okay, just so PHP doesn't worry us anymore. Okay, so let's run that, and it's still squawking. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna say lesson ID equals end of lesson IDs, and rather than getting the end right here, I'm gonna say lesson IDs. That's it. So it's telling us only variables should be passed by reference. That's a PHP thing. Okay, so we can't actually pass a method into this method such that it takes in a variable and stuff like that. Too much nesting. So I think it should be fine by now. Let's run that again. Okay, so field asserting that 2 matches expected 3. Okay, so let's check out that test. Remember, we want the next lesson that the user should be watching and not the last lesson that the user watched. Okay, so what we should do is, once we find that lesson, we should get the next lesson in the series that the user should watch. Okay, remember we have get next lesson. If we head over to our lesson.php, we have get next lesson in the series, in the playlist, right? So we can call this method on this lesson. Okay, and I think that should give us the correct result. Okay, so 4 does not match expected type object. Let's check out our test. 165 assert equals lesson 4. Great, we should actually be checking lesson 4 ID, right? So let's run that one more time. Great, we have a successful test finally. So all we did was get all the lessons that this user has completed, and then we get the ID of the last one, which means that's the latest that the user completed, and then we get that lesson, and then we get the next lesson in the playlist. Okay, so what we can do is actually write a little test to protect ourselves, because remember, we are doing a lot of assumptions right here. In case there is no next lesson to watch and we pass it into this method, it's going to break. For example, it can break right here because this is going to be null, and then we're calling a method on null, and that's gonna really be a big deal, but I'm gonna handle it in a couple of lessons. For now, I think this is gonna really help us in a few. So let's work on this in the very next lesson.